Hey guys, so today I'm going to intro A Doll's House and the specific type of drama it falls into, melodrama. A Doll's House is often considered one of the most important and influential plays ever written in terms of its impact, in terms of the impact that it's had on the genre of drama as a whole. So that's one of the reasons we're reading it, because it's pretty important in the development of drama. So, to start with, we're going to talk about melodrama because A Doll's House is a melodrama. So, when we're talking about melodrama, you may have heard another version of this word as melodramatic when someone's being overly exaggerated or dramatic. That's because in melodramas, in these plays and stories that we would classify as melodramas, these are dramatic works with exaggerated characters and events that are meant to appeal to emotions. Everything is over the top. If you want an example of modern day melodramas, think soap operas. Melodramas are not typically meant to be truly realistic. They amplify everything up to 11 to try and appeal to your baser emotions. And basically the way they do that is they exaggerate everything. The characters in melodramas are generally stereotypes. They generally don't have a lot of character development. They are only defined by a few simplistic qualities. And those two traits become that character. That's who this person is. And then the way melodramas will often play around with that is they will take characters with conflicting or, these character traits that will play well off of each other, and they'll stick them in situations together to elicit these emotional responses from the audience and appeal to our emotions. Major themes in melodramas. Melodramas typically tend to prioritize traditional family values and morality. So common plot threads would typically involve love and romance, or couples dealing with like infidelity or relationship issues. And the whole point of these storylines is meant to reinforce these traditional family values and morality. And critically, melodramas are generally not respected all that much because most of the time they're considered to be overly simplistic and generally lacking in substance. Most melodramas lack subtlety. So these are generally viewed as plays or stories meant for entertainment and less for artistic expression, if that makes sense. Kind of going back to like the Shakespearean mindset towards plays, where these are entertainment, or this is entertainment. It's not art. It's not literary expression. Now, A Doll's House is a melodrama, but it plays around with this format, and ultimately, it's not necessarily a critique of It's not necessarily a critique of melodrama, but it definitely plays around with the traditional conventions of melodrama, which we'll talk about and go over later on when after you've read it and as we're reading it. If I mention it right now, it's not really going to make sense because you guys haven't read it yet. Okay, so A Doll's House was written by Captain Sideburn, or whatever those things are. Captain Right Triangle. I don't know. Those are some face whiskers. Anyway, Henrik Ibsen wrote A Doll's House. He was a Norwegian playwright. He is generally considered within the dramatic community as the father of realism. He is the major playwright that started writing plays that were meant to be more realistic. So when we're talking about realism, this is the dramatic movement that I mentioned in my intro video that strives to make theater more realistic. They want to portray real people in realistic scenarios, or rather, realistic characters in realistic scenarios. And Ibsen was the first major playwright to really start experimenting with that. And then later on in the 1800s, his counterpoint from the acting perspective was the Russian Konstantin Stanislavski, who pioneered the school of method acting, as I talked about, which strove to better enable actors to give more realistic performances. And both of those trends go hand in hand when we're talking about realism in drama. The playwrights writing more realistic characters and more realistic situations, but also the actors training themselves to be able to portray more realistic characters and realistic emotions. So again, the main trend of realism, the characters and scenarios written in plays were meant to be relatable and plausible in real life. So you're gone are the intricately woven plot lines of Shakespearean tragedies where you've got mistaken identities and murders and deaths and tragic love stories and over the top epicness. No. Real plays in the realist school or the realist vein are really trying to be more slice of life. They're not trying to be that fantastical. We, the audience, are actually meant to relate to the people we see and relate to the situations and the problems they face. And Ibsen really took that to heart. A lot of his plays were actually pretty controversial when they came out because Ibsen used drama to criticize social norms and cultural traditions. He would challenge contemporary issues in society in his writing, and oftentimes that was unpopular. A Doll's House was no exception. So A Doll's House was first performed in 1879. It was originally written in Norwegian, so we're actually not reading the original text of the play, we're reading a translation to English. A Doll's House became popular in Norway, partly because of its controversial content. And when I say controversial content, I mean for the time. Like if you read this now, it's pretty tame. But for the time, it was controversial. And that controversy created a buzz throughout Europe, and it was soon translated into a bunch of different languages and performed all over Europe in the late 1800s. It was controversial because of the... Man, I cannot talk today. It was controversial because of the way it depicted family and gender roles. The story is actually, it's presented in the format of a melodrama, but it uses this format of melodrama to criticize and take a hard look at the contemporary nature of gender roles and family dynamics in the 1800s. And it does have some pretty, not necessarily harsh things, but it does take the rose-colored glasses that a lot of the people in that time period had off when it examined gender roles and family dynamics. And the gist of this story is really about the marriage between Nora and Torvald Helmer. So just to introduce this story, introduce the play. So our main characters are the Helmers. Nora is our protagonist. So she's a young, married, traditional middle-class housewife. Or a traditional middle-class woman, meaning she is a housewife. She has 3 children, and the bulk of her day is spent not actually necessarily taking care of the children, but making sure the house is an environment that she feels will satisfy the needs and desires of her family, make her family happy. Her husband is, sorry, I cannot talk today. I apologize. Her husband is Torvald, who has recently been promoted to the manager of a bank in town. Again, like Nora being a traditional middle-class woman, Torvald is meant to be a traditional middle-class husband. So right off the bat, Ibsen is writing characters that we are meant to relate to, or rather his audience was meant to relate to. The Helmers are meant to be a typical middle-class couple. And by all accounts, a happily married, established middle-class couple. Right? Dr. Rank is their family friend. He is dying of consumption, which was the term used at the time to refer to tuberculosis. They mentioned that Rank inherited consumption from his father. Basically, his father fooled around a lot and got the disease, and then passed it down to Dr. Rank when he was a child, when he was basically developing in his mother. And that has heavily influenced the way Dr. Rank views humanity and society, where he basically feels punished for something that he didn't even do. It was his father who basically gave him, it was because of his father's actions that he has consumption and that he is dying prematurely. Christine Lynn, the other major woman in the play, she is Nora's childhood friend, and she is recently widowed, and she has moved to town in search of a job. She mentions that as a widow, her husband has left her nothing because his money ran out before he died, and so she now has to work, which is something that in this time, in this society, women were not really expected to do. Her husband was supposed to provide for her, but now Mrs. Lynn is left without a husband and is now forced to provide for herself. This does become an important point as the play progresses. Last major character, which I hesitate to call him the antagonist, but within the melodramatic format, he would be the antagonist, Nils Krogstad. He is an employee at Torvald's bank. They've been co-workers for a while. They don't really get along. And Krogstad is a widower and a single father who is really struggling to provide for his children. They mention in the play, in the first act, that Krogstad has a pretty shady past. He has been involved in some pretty shady business dealings that should be classified as fraud or, again, illegal, but because of essentially the way it's implied to be like a paperwork mistake or some clever legal maneuvering on Krogstad's part, he manages to escape all prosecution. So even though he has not been legally punished or he's not being punished by law, everyone in town looks down on him because everyone in town knows that he's been kind of shady in the past. And with this setup of the characters, again, the play really is about the life and marriage of Nora and Torvald, and basically examining some events happening to them around Christmas time one year. So major themes that Ibsen expresses, as I mentioned before, Ibsen really presents a deep and sharp critique of gender roles and the social status of women, as the setup might indicate, and as some of the images might indicate. Ibsen really does play with the traditional notion of women, or the traditional notion that women's place was in the home, and that a woman's priority should be to care for her husband and her children and make sure they're happy and taken care of. And by doing that, the culture at the time basically believed that that should be enough to make her happy. Ibsen does present some challenges to this notion. Deception also plays an important role in this play. all five of the major characters in this play actively engage in deception or at least attempt to deceive each other. All of them have secrets, and nobody is as they necessarily appear to be. They all have, if not a dark side, they all have skeletons in their closet that are impacting and influencing the actions they're taking in the play. And again, it does have a melodramatic setup, but in contrary to most melodramas, A Doll's House actually does deeply develop its characters and kind of plays around with that setup to make a more realistic and substantial a more realistic and developed version of a melodrama. It's not meant to be all surface and superficial. There is depth to this play, even though it does, on the surface, have the setup of a melodrama. I really enjoy this play. This is always an interesting play to read and discuss and talk about. It's an interesting play to see live and perform in live. I was in this play when I was in college. I played Dr. Rank, so I had a really happy time in this. But it's a really interesting and thought-provoking play that should hopefully provide for some interesting discussion as we go forward. So that being said, I hope you guys find this play intriguing. Take today to finish up all the stuff you still have to do with trifles, with your last discussion board replies, and those questions. And we will get rolling with Doll's House later on in the week. See ya.